Hi, I'm Calder. My father missed every milestone of my life. My 13th birthday? Gone. My college graduation? Empty chair where he should have been. For decades, I was nothing more than a shadow to him. But the moment I was granted legal inheritance rights to the $972 million Gray estate, suddenly I was family again. He sent me an invitation to a grand reunion ceremony. Said we had urgent family matters to discuss. He never cared about me. Not until I was worth something. So yeah, I showed up. But not for the reasons he thought. And when I walked into that ballroom, holding the one thing they spent years trying to erase, everything changed. But here's the real question. Why did my name vanish from the will, just 2 years after I turned 15? The envelope was thick, too thick to be anything casual, and it had my full name on the front. Calder Merrick. Not Cal, not son. Just Calder Merrick, centered in gold embossed script like a bank letter, not a father's note. It sat quietly on the kitchen table while I stood over it like it might explode. Houston's late summer light poured through the windows, casting long stripes across the hardwood floor. I just finished a meeting call when I saw it sitting there, delivered by courier, no return address. The seal was still intact. I didn't need to open it to feel the weight. I already knew who sent it. Only one person in my life had ever used this kind of parchment and pomp. My father, Merrick. I sliced it open with the tip of a steak knife. Inside, there was a single card, thick, elegant, impersonal. You are cordially invited to the Merrick family reunion. Attendance is requested. Urgent matters will be discussed. It was signed in ink, Merrick C. Merrick. No dad, no warmth. Just his name and the word requested, as if I were an employee being summoned to the annual board meeting. I sat down, letting the card rest in my hand. For a long minute, the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. I could almost hear the silence that had stretched between us all these years, 2 decades and change, settle between my ribs again. It always fit too well. The last time my father spoke my name was at my high school senior awards night. He showed up 5 minutes late, nodded at me from the back of the auditorium, then disappeared before I stepped off the stage. Later that week, I found out he'd left during intermission to catch a flight for a golf trip in Scottsdale with his colleagues. That was Merrick. Never say no to business, but always say maybe to blood. I reread the invitation. Urgent matters. What could possibly be so urgent now? I hadn't spoken to him, my siblings, or anyone carrying the Merrick name since the year I walked out of that house. I didn't even return for my mother's funeral. Merrick made sure of that. The flight itinerary he sent was to the wrong city. Claimed it was a mistake. He always had a tidy excuse for betrayal. Back then, I told myself I'd moved on. Built my own name, my own success. But sitting in that kitchen, with that envelope in my hand, I could feel the resentment still breathing in my bones. I tapped my phone, needing a distraction. That's when the notification flashed across the screen. Wilkins and Hartwell, LLP. Inheritance filing confirmed. Calder Merrick linked. The full document opened with a swipe. Official, signed, and time-stamped. It named me a partial beneficiary of the Merrick Estate Holdings portfolio. My rights to inheritance were finalized as of 10:02 a.m. that very morning. $972 million. The number burned into my mind like wildfire. My father must have seen it, probably minutes before this invitation was drafted and couriered to my door. That explained everything. The sudden interest, the performative reunion, the urgency. This wasn't about family. This was about leverage. I leaned back in my chair. the weight of the truth anchoring my spine. So that's why he wants me back. Not because he missed me, not because he regrets the silence, but because he wants control. The irony was almost poetic. I could have thrown the invitation away, ignored it, blocked his number if he dared to call again. But instead, I sat there, letting 20 years of buried history rise like steam from boiling water. Not rage, not even sadness, just clarity. I was never going to be his son the way he wanted me to be, obedient, grateful, invisible. And I wasn't going to walk back into that estate just to be dismissed again. If he wanted a meeting, he'd get one. But this time, it would be on my terms. I got up, walked into the bedroom, and pulled open the second drawer in my dresser. Nestled between old cufflinks and a broken watch was a small silver button, smooth, cool to the touch. My grandfather gave it to me when I was 10. Told me it was part of a military coat he wore in Korea. Said, "Keep this close. It'll remind you who you are when others try to tell you otherwise." I carried it the day I left that house. I hadn't touched it in years. Now I slipped it into my blazer pocket. And just like that, the boy who once stood alone on a high school stage, scanning an empty Sarah Explains bro for a father who never showed, he was no longer silent. He'd grown up. And he was walking back into the lion's den. I stared at the envelope on the passenger seat, the ivory paper now creased at the edges from how tightly I'd held it earlier. The morning light filtered through my windshield, painting thin shadows across the dashboard as I sat in the driveway. A reunion, a ceremony, a second chance, or a trap. I wasn't sure which, but I wasn't heading there empty-handed. Before leaving home, I went through the lockbox I kept beneath my bed. Birth certificate, social security card, real estate contracts, business licenses, archived emails, every piece of paper that proved I built a life without them. If I was going to face that family again, I wanted to be reminded of who I became without their name backing me. On the floor by my feet, I stacked 3 manila folders into a worn leather bag. One held my personal records. One held the contracts I signed when I launched my first commercial build in East Houston. The third was blank, but I slipped it in anyway, just in case there was something I'd learned that needed documenting. I wasn't just attending a reunion, I was attending a negotiation. I backed the truck down the driveway slowly. I hadn't seen Merrick, or any of them, in over 20 years. The last time I heard my sister's voice, it was laced with cold obligation at my mother's funeral. Even then, Merrick didn't say a word to me. Not one. I made it 3 blocks before my phone buzzed. A name flashed across the screen that I hadn't seen in over a decade. Clara Devons, my grandfather's last caretaker. I hadn't even realized she still had my number. The message was brief. "Mr. Calder, I hope this reaches you in time. There was something your grandfather wanted you to have before he passed, a sealed envelope. But Merrick took it, said he'd pass it along. I found it in his office drawer last week, unopened." I pulled over at the first gas station I saw. The truck idled, humming beneath me while my hands stayed still on the wheel. The message glowed back at me. There it was. Proof. It wasn't just that Merrick ignored me all these years. He actively erased me. He took messages that were meant for me, kept words I was supposed to read, hid pieces of truth I didn't even know existed. I leaned back in the seat, letting my head rest against the headrest. A long breath escaped before I even realized I was holding it. Suddenly, it wasn't just bitterness I felt. It was something closer to grief. Not for what happened, but for what had been stolen so quietly I didn't even know to mourn it. What else did he bury? The silence over the years hadn't been passive. It had been curated, orchestrated. The engine purred as I pulled back onto the road and made my way to my lawyer's office. Daniel Becker had been my attorney for years. We never had much to talk about until last week when a certified packet arrived at his office with my name on it, making the inheritance official. He called me that same afternoon, his voice flat with disbelief. "Looks like someone finally overrode Merrick's preferences," he'd said. Inside his office now, Daniel looked even more tense. "They tried to box you out, Calder," he said, sliding a set of papers across his polished oak desk. Amendments were filed gradually over 15 years, small changes, but they added up. My name had been removed from more than one document. They couldn't exclude you entirely because of a clause your grandfather added the year before he died, Daniel continued. That clause locked in your rights. Merrick didn't have the legal authority to undo it without triggering a court challenge, which, I assume, he wanted to avoid. A part of me wanted to laugh, but nothing about it was funny. "So, for years," I said slowly, "he tried to erase me quietly." Daniel didn't answer. He didn't have to. By the time I left the office, my heart was no longer pounding. It was steady, focused. I slipped the silver button from my pocket and held it in my palm for a second. My grandfather gave it to me when I was 16. No ceremony, no applause. Just a quiet handoff on a rainy afternoon in the barn behind his house. "You'll need your own armor," he'd said. "Not everyone in this family uses theirs for protection." I closed my fingers around the button now and whispered into the space around me. "I'm not going for you to see me, Grandpa. I'm going so they know I saw you." I wasn't chasing affection anymore. I wasn't asking to be included. I was going to claim what was mine, not because I wanted the money, but because I wouldn't let them rewrite me out of my own story. I climbed back into the truck, drove toward home, and tried to clear my head. The road blurred beneath the wheels, and just before turning into my street, my phone lit up again. New group message. Mandatory reunion attendance. All heirs present. The message below it chilled me more than I expected. "Calder, we expect you. Do not be late." I stared at it for a long minute. So, it wasn't a reunion. It was a summons. I sat motionless at the edge of my bed, staring down at the glowing screen. The group message thread stayed open, still unread by most of the heirs Merrick had corralled into one digital pen like cattle. I hadn't been grouped under the word family in decades. And now, here I was, slotted between cousins I didn't recognize and siblings I hadn't spoken to since Mom's funeral. My name sat wedged beneath his, like I belonged again. But it didn't feel like belonging. It felt like being targeted. I powered off the phone and stood up. Packing wasn't difficult. I wasn't choosing outfits for sentiment, just defense. I folded one suit, dark gray, quiet strength. 2 shirts, no tie. And then came the documents. One folder held a copy of the revised estate filings my lawyer had shown me, proof of the legal clause my grandfather had snuck in. Another held years of tax records and profit breakdowns from the real estate projects I'd built. I wasn't bringing a suitcase. I was bringing ammunition. The silver button stayed in my pocket, as always. My flight to New York was at 4:45 p.m. I left the house at noon. I needed time to breathe, to check the weather, to run through what-ifs. But mostly, I just didn't want to sit still. When I stopped moving, I started remembering things I didn't want to. The car was quiet during the drive to the airport. Windows down, early fall wind cutting across my neck. I kept thinking about that text from Clara, the caretaker, about the envelope Merrick never gave me. My grandfather had trusted him to pass it on. That said everything about both of them. One still believed people could change. The other proved they don't. As I pulled into the long-term parking lot and killed the engine, my phone buzzed again. Just one sentence from an unknown number. They didn't expect you to get the inheritance. Be careful. I stared at it, then read it again. And again. It was unsigned, but the cadence was familiar. Sharp, economical, afraid. Lauren, my older sister. She used to leave notes like that when we were kids. Short sentences under my door when things got tense in the house. She never spoke up publicly, never defended me. But she watched everything. That message cracked something in me I didn't know was still intact. Maybe she wasn't safe either. Maybe none of them were. I moved slowly, climbing out of the car and double-checking my folders before locking up. In the terminal, the crowds were light. I stood in the self-check line, scanning my boarding pass from the airline app. The screen blinked red. "Sir?" A uniformed attendant stepped in, polite but rehearsed. "There's been a seat reassignment. One moment." I blinked. "Excuse me?" "You've been moved. A family representative updated your seat earlier this morning." My jaw stiffened. "Who?" The attendant tapped at her tablet. "A Mr. Merrick Gray." Of course. She looked up, clearly sensing the shift in my face. He insisted. I let out a quiet breath and shook my head. "Move me back. No, upgrade me. First class. Window seat." She blinked, then nodded. "We can do that." She didn't ask for my reason. I didn't offer one. It wasn't about legroom. It was about the message. Merrick had tried to place me in 38E, last row, aisle, next to the bathroom. A symbolic seat for a symbolic son. But I'd spent enough of my life in the back row. I sat near gate 17A with a bottled water and nothing else in my hands. No phone, no folder. Just silence and the memory of that message. "They didn't expect you to get the inheritance." Lauren's voice echoed in my mind. She wasn't warning me because she cared. She was warning me because she knew what our father was capable of. And maybe, just maybe, she didn't want to be part of it anymore. I rubbed the silver button between my thumb and index finger, noticing a new scratch across the top. It must have scraped against the keyring in my pocket. The scratch felt right, proof it had been through something too. It reminded me, they didn't make me. They shaped the vacuum I grew in, but they didn't form me. The boarding call came over the speaker. I stood slowly, letting the rest of the passengers shuffle past first. I wanted space. As I walked down the jet bridge, my phone buzzed again. No text, just a voice message. 2 seconds. I pressed play. Lauren's whisper, "Don't trust the first thing Dad says." That was it. 2 seconds. But enough to confirm what I'd known in my bones since the envelope. Since the seat change. Since the legal blocks that almost worked. They weren't inviting me home. They were baiting me into a setup, and I walked straight into the city they controlled. The jet wheels screeched against the tarmac at LaGuardia, and for a second, the silence in the cabin was louder than the engines. I stared at the seatbelt sign, still glowing. My stomach felt tight, not from turbulence, but from everything I knew, and everything I didn't. Manhattan greeted me like a place that had already made up its mind about who I was. The cab ride was quick, but it didn't feel short. The streets blurred past in wet streaks. New York humidity hung thick, as if the air itself were eavesdropping. By the time I stepped out onto the curb of the gray Lux Hotel, My shirt clung to my back. This place? It was their jewel, the shining symbol of the empire. And for the first time, I was walking in not as an outsider, but not as one of them either. The doorman hesitated a beat before opening the car door. I caught that flicker of confusion in his eyes, recognition muddled by years of my name being whispered in corners, never celebrated in the light. My picture wasn't on the family wall. Hell, I doubt half the board even remembered Merrick had a son named Calder. Inside, the lobby was exactly as I remembered from a visit long ago. Grand marble floors, golden chandeliers, and a silence that made even footsteps feel like trespassing. I approached the front desk, gave my name. The receptionist, a young man, sharp suit, overly trained smile, typed something, paused, then typed again. His fingers hovered uncertainly. "I have a reservation under Calder Gray," I said flatly, watching him try to reconcile what was on the screen with the man in front of him. "Yes, sir," he finally said, then leaned closer and lowered his voice. "A standard king room has been prepared for you on the 5th floor." I frowned. "A standard room?" He nodded, eyes darting nervously. "The suites are already assigned to the other guests. Instructions came directly from Mr. Merrick Gray." Of course they did. I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. Instead, I reached into my jacket, pulled out my phone, and showed him a digital confirmation from my attorney's office. Proof of my official stake, my newly recognized position in the Gray estate. "Please upgrade me to the penthouse. Charge it directly to the Gray inheritance ledger." He blinked. "The penthouse?" "Unless someone wants to call the family lawyers and explain why the only legal heir staying here doesn't have a suite." He typed quickly after that. Very quickly. 10 minutes later, I was stepping out of the elevator, alone, into the private hallway that led to the penthouse. The keycard beeped. I walked in. Silence. High ceilings. Floor-to-ceiling windows. A cityscape that stretched beyond what even Merrick could own. I dropped my bag on the leather couch, walked over to the bar, poured a glass of still water. The glass trembled slightly in my hand. Not from nerves, but from the heat rising under my skin. Being here, in this hotel, in this city, brought back echoes I hadn't heard in years. Like the time I stood in the corner of the family ballroom while Lauren and the others had their birthdays celebrated with fireworks and speeches. Mine was skipped because the staff had scheduling conflicts, or when Merrick had called me an oversight in front of a board member at a gala. Every time I'd thought I'd buried the past, it clawed its way back up. And now here I was, no longer invisible, but still being treated like I was. I walked over to the suite's sleek desk and took the silver button out of my pocket. Placed it down gently. Its edges were worn now, a new scratch catching the light. I ran my thumb over it. "You saw me when no one else did," I whispered. To no one, really. Maybe to Selton. Maybe to the part of myself I hadn't silenced. A soft chime buzzed from my phone. Text notification. "Mandatory family dinner tonight. Attendance required." And below it, a private message from Merrick. "We have much to discuss. Come alone." I stared at it for a long time. A setup. Every move had been scripted. The room downgrade. The lack of recognition. The subtle slights. The passive-aggressive texts. Merrick wasn't just pulling strings. He was setting a stage, one where I'd be cast back into the same role I thought I'd outgrown. I sat down on the edge of the bed, letting the tension in my chest simmer instead of explode. I wasn't here for comfort. I wasn't here for dinner. I was here for answers. Just as I stood to get changed, my phone buzzed again. A voicemail from Lauren, 2 seconds long. A whisper. Don't trust the first thing Dad says. That was it. But it was enough, because suddenly I realized tonight wouldn't be about welcoming me back. It would be about putting me back in my place. The room was quiet as I finished buttoning my shirt. The air conditioning in the penthouse hummed low, but even that couldn't cool the weight that settled in my chest. I glanced down at the message again. Merrick's words felt more like a command than an invitation. Come alone. I stood still for a moment, staring at my reflection in the mirror. Same face, same eyes. But the man staring back wasn't the boy they used to break down. Not anymore. I tucked the silver button into my pocket, always the last thing I carried before facing them, and headed for the elevator. As I descended to the 12th floor, where the private family suite was located, I could already feel the shift. My body went stiller, my breath shorter, my mind sharper, like walking into a courtroom where every witness was hostile and the judge already bought. The elevator chimed. Outside the double doors, a server waited quietly and opened them before I could knock. I stepped into the suite. Everyone was already seated. Merrick at the head of the long, polished table. Ilara to his right, Silas to the left. Further down, an uncle I hadn't seen in years, a cousin I barely remembered, and a great-aunt who once told me I was too quiet to be trusted. The table was immaculate. White linen, sterling silver, wine already poured. Name cards were placed in front of each seat, hand-scripted in perfect calligraphy, except mine. My card looked like it had been printed on office paper. It was slightly crooked, typed in Arial, and stuck at the far end of the table. I walked slowly down the length of the room. Nobody stood. Merrick didn't lift his gaze. Ilara offered a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Silas looked down, pretending to adjust his napkin. When I reached my seat, I pulled the chair back, and it wobbled. One leg uneven. The message was clear. Deliberate. I sat anyway. Dinner began without welcome, without grace. It was only after the appetizers had been cleared that Merrick spoke. He didn't look at me when he did. His gaze stayed focused straight ahead, as if I were a side note, a subject rather than a son. I want to start tonight with clarity, he said, voice calm, controlled. This gathering isn't about nostalgia or sentiment. It's about stewardship. The estate has grown complicated, and now, with Calder's unexpected inheritance being formalized, it's important we address concerns. There was a pause, like he expected someone to object. No one did. He went on. Calder has been distant, disconnected. His choices over the years have been, at times, erratic, emotional. We believe, for the good of the family legacy, it would be wise to consolidate decision-making for the time being, until he adjusts. It wasn't a proposal. It was a script, rehearsed, polished. My chest tightened. The air in the room felt thinner. He was framing me, the unstable one, the outsider, the wild card who needed supervision, like when I was 14, and asked why he missed my school play, and he told the therapist I was dramatic. Or when I was 21 and accused Ilara of sabotaging a project I'd pitched, he said I was projecting insecurity. They'd always had words for me. Now they had a narrative. I looked around the table. No one spoke. No one defended me. They all knew what this was. I stayed silent. Not because I didn't want to respond, but because I was watching, studying, noting the ones who nodded slightly, the ones who shifted uncomfortably, and the ones, like Ilara, who looked pleased. Then Silas stood. He raised his glass. "I care about this family," he said, voice steady. "And I care about Calder. But I think we all agree. What matters now is unity. Temporary consolidation of voting rights seems reasonable, just until things stabilize." My stomach dropped. Silas. If there had been any part of me left that believed in family, he was the piece I'd clung to. He didn't look at me, not once, and that silence said everything. They'd coordinated this. Every word, every gesture. They weren't reacting. They were performing. The betrayal hit deeper than Merrick's, because I'd hoped Silas would see me, and now all I saw in him was fear, or greed, maybe both. The next moments blurred. Plates were cleared, coffee poured, a document appeared, placed beside my untouched dessert. "Just a temporary rights delegation," Merrick said lightly. "Sign it now or take a few days. Either way, it's best for all of us." I stared at the paper, and for a moment, I felt 12 again. 14, 17, every age where I sat at a gray table and was told, subtly or directly, that I misunderstood, that I overreacted, that I didn't belong. But I wasn't that boy anymore. I slipped my hand into my pocket, felt the curve of the silver button. "You walk your own path," my grandfather once said, "even if they pretend not to see you." I looked up, smiled. "I'll consider it," I said. The room relaxed. They thought they'd won, but I stood before they could respond. I nodded politely, then walked out, the unsigned document left untouched behind me. In the hallway, just as I was about to press the elevator button, I heard heels click against the marble. Elara. She stopped beside me, leaned in close, her voice barely above a whisper. "You were never meant to have any of this," she said. "Don't embarrass yourself further." I turned slowly, met her eyes, and said, "We'll see who embarrasses whom." She didn't follow me after that. The elevator doors closed and I stood alone, watching my reflection blur slightly in the chrome walls. That familiar face again, same lines, same scars, but my shoulders were different, more upright, heavier too, but not with shame, with purpose. When I reached the penthouse, I didn't turn on any lights. I dropped my phone and room key on the desk, then sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing the same shirt from dinner. The city outside buzzed on, oblivious to the storm I just walked through. Inside me, something was unraveling, quietly. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there, breathing, letting the ache of it all pulse through. I thought about walking away. I really did. What if I just handed it over? Let Merrick have it. Let them all win. I'd go back to my life, start fresh somewhere no one knew the name Gray. I even picked up my phone, dialed the first 3 digits of my lawyer's number. Then my eyes landed on the silver button. It was resting on the nightstand, catching a sliver of city light. Small, unassuming, but it burned like a brand. I remembered the last time I saw my grandfather hold it. He pressed it into my palm and whispered, "You walk your own path, even if they pretend not to see you." I dropped the phone, laid back on the bed, stared at the ceiling until sleep took me without warning. The next morning was dull gray, the kind of light that blurred hours together. I woke up with the kind of fatigue that didn't come from lack of sleep, but from carrying too much for too long. The remnants of last night still clung to me. Merrick's measured speech, Silas's betrayal, Elara's venom. I forced myself up, made black coffee, and unsealed the envelope Merrick had tried to get me to sign. I flipped through the document, each line dripping with polite legalese. Then, on the back page, I noticed something strange. A faint rectangular indentation, as if another slip of paper had once been pressed there and then removed. Not torn, slipped. I held the paper up to the window, angling it against the light. There was definitely something missing, something that had been there before the document made its way to me. And knowing Merrick, it wasn't accidental. I scanned it again, slower this time. There was a line spacing irregularity on one clause, almost like it had been reformatted. If I'd signed it, I might have unknowingly agreed to terms that no longer appeared on this copy. That changed everything. Suddenly, it wasn't just manipulation. It was potential fraud. I called David, my longtime attorney from Manhattan. Not tied to the family. Trusted. He picked up on the third ring. Called her. I was hoping you'd call. Within the hour, I was dressed and in a cab headed downtown. We met at his office, a modest brownstone tucked between glass towers. He took one look at the document and his jaw clenched. If there was a carbon sheet removed before you, signed, and if it contained conflicting terms, he could argue you agreed to something you didn't see. So he planned it, I said, voice low. Looks that way, David replied, and that could be enough to get your voting rights revoked. Permanently. I stared out the window behind him. The skyline looked different this morning. Not just bigger, but darker. I want to see everything, I said. Everything tied to the estate. Old charters, board notes, all of it. David nodded. You'll need to go to the family's private archive facility. It's where they store non-digitized records. Most heirs don't even know it exists. I do now. He made a call, arranged an access request under my legal rights as an inheriting heir. I was at the archive 2 hours later. The building sat in the Flatiron District, an unmarked gray brick structure wedged between a coffee shop and a dry cleaner. Inside, cool, stale air wrapped around rows of steel cabinets and fingerprint scanners. A woman in a dark vest stepped out from behind a bulletproof desk. I'm here to access Vault 3, I said. She hesitated. I'm sorry. Access is restricted. Only Mr. Merrick Gray is approved for... I'm legally entitled, I cut in. Pull the log. You'll see my name was added last week. Reluctantly, she tapped on her tablet, then paused. Her eyes flicked up to meet mine. You're right. It was added. Yesterday. She led me through 2 locked doors and down a narrow hallway lined with security cameras. At the end stood a thick steel door with a glowing fingerprint pad. After verifying me again, the door opened with a mechanical hiss. Vault 3 was colder than I expected. Inside were leather-bound binders, sealed boxes, and metal drawers labeled in sharp handwriting. I moved slowly, scanning shelves until a logbook caught my eye. Merrick's signature. Twice. Both visits logged last week, right before I got the reunion invitation. Right before the dinner. He wasn't reacting to my presence. He was preempting it. They'd known this might happen, that my name could rise again, that the will might resurface, and they'd planned accordingly. I ran my fingers along one box marked Succession, Drafts, 1997-2003. Inside were 3 folders. The first listed me, Calder Gray, as the primary successor, age 13, my grandfather's handwriting. The second folder, dated 2 years later, listed Merrick, Ilara, and Silas. My name was nowhere to be found. I didn't lose my place. I was removed. By someone. On purpose. My chest tightened. Not from sadness, but something colder. A fury so sharp it felt like clarity. They hadn't ignored me because I didn't matter. They ignored me because I had. Outside the building, the wind had picked up. January in Manhattan has a way of reminding you you're small. But for the first time, I didn't feel that way. I stood still for a moment, letting the wind slap against my face like a challenge. Then I pulled out my phone. David picked up immediately. "Prepare everything," I said. "We're not playing defense anymore. I want a full strategy, media, legal, financial." There was silence on the line. Then his voice came through, steady. "Understood." I ended the call, slipped the phone into my pocket, and looked back once more at the archive behind me. Because Merrick had started a war he didn't realize I was prepared to finish. I stepped off the curb and kept walking. The city didn't slow for personal vendettas, but I wasn't moving like a man stuck in the past anymore. I wasn't dragging a lifetime of unanswered questions behind me. I walked fast, straight, decisive. I knew exactly where I was going. By the time I reached the gray firm headquarters, the sky had shifted, still gray, but cracked with light. That building never changed. Glass walls, polished floors, everything sterile and untouchable. Merrick built it to reflect himself. Smooth, reflective, impossible to pin down. I passed the receptionist, who looked up too quickly, then down again like she wasn't sure if she should greet me or call security. "Morning, Mr. Gray," someone mumbled near the elevators. A junior associate, I think. Couldn't meet my eye. No one could. They all knew something was happening. They just didn't know whose side to be on. The elevator doors slid open to the executive floor. I didn't wait for an invitation. Merrick's office was at the end, corner, of course. He liked being above it all. Sunlight spilled through his floor-to-ceiling windows like it was curated for him personally. He looked up when I walked in. Calm, collected, fingers still on the keyboard as if I hadn't just walked into his sanctum unannounced. "Called her," he said smoothly. "Didn't expect you this morning." I shut the door behind me. "If I called first," I said, "you'd have had time to hide things." His mouth twitched. That small, practiced smile he used when pretending not to be cornered. He gestured toward the leather chair across from him. I didn't sit. Instead, he reached into the drawer and slid a manila folder across the desk. I opened it without a word. Inside, a psychological evaluation. Fake, but dressed in official language. My name printed neatly at the top. A fictional diagnosis. Words like emotionally erratic and fiscally immature. Signed by someone I'd never met. Probably paid off. Probably someone who owed him favors. He said it like he cared. "I'm protecting you from decisions you're not ready to make." Same tone he used when I was 12 and begged to go to a summer program, and he told me I wouldn't thrive outside of structure. Back then, I believed him. Not anymore. "You don't care if I fail," I said, still standing. "You care what I might uncover." He didn't respond. For the first time in a long time, Merrick didn't have a line ready. That moment hung in the air. Him blinking, me steady. He finally broke it with a calculated move. He pressed a button on the edge of his desk. A quiet buzz. Seconds later, a uniformed security guard stepped inside. Merrick didn't even look at him when he spoke. "Mr. Gray is no longer permitted on executive floors. Please escort him downstairs." The guard hesitated. Just a beat, enough to tell me he didn't want to do it. I didn't resist, because I knew exactly what Merrick was trying to do. He wanted me angry, loud. He wanted a scene, but I didn't give him that. I gave him silence. And that, judging by the way his jaw clenched as I walked out, bothered him more than a shouting match ever could. Outside, the street noise washed over me like static. Cold air, fast horns, city rhythm pressing forward. I stood still, not because I was lost, because I was anchoring. I knew what just happened. He didn't try to argue. He didn't deny. He went straight for humiliation. Just like always. Push Calder far enough that he breaks, then call him unstable. But this time, I didn't break. I felt humiliated, yes, betrayed. But I didn't feel small. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, maybe 10. Then my phone buzzed. A message from David. We found additional discrepancies. You'll want to come in. The law office was quiet when I arrived. They gave me coffee without asking. A receptionist held the door for me with a look that said, "They told me what happened." David met me in a small conference room. No windows, just one long table. He didn't waste time. "Laurel," he said, nodding to the woman beside him, "runs our financial review team." She slid several documents toward me. Spreadsheets, reports, audit trails. Then she pointed to a column of entries highlighted in yellow. Merrick submitted altered financial statements to the board in 2019, she said, her voice calm. Claims of revenue shortfall, projected losses, all exaggerated or outright false. I flipped the pages. He had used those reports to justify consolidating board control and removing my voting access under the guise of stabilizing assets. He claimed the estate needed emergency authority, Laurel added, but the losses weren't real. The estate was solvent. So he lied to secure power, I said quietly. David nodded. And with this evidence, we can make that case, legally, publicly. I looked down at the papers again. I remembered the day I found out I'd been cut from the family foundation. No explanation, no hearing. Just gone. At the time, I told myself it was a mistake, that maybe I missed an email, that Merrick had his reasons. Now I saw it for what it was. They didn't just shut me out emotionally. They shut me out systematically, deliberately. And now, I had proof. I leaned back in the chair, let the weight of it settle. For a moment, I didn't speak. Then I looked at David. My voice was steady. It's time they learn I didn't come here alone. By the time I left his office, the folder in my hands felt heavier than it should have. Not because of the paper, but because of what it meant. Years of being silenced, erased, reduced to an afterthought. And now proof that every bit of it had been orchestrated. I returned to the hotel, showered in silence, and changed into a suit my grandfather had once called gray navy. Deep blue, sharp cut, quiet authority. I added the silver button to the inside of my pocket like armor. Then I picked up the folder, took one last breath, and stepped out into the wind. This time, I wasn't walking into a trap. This time, I was ready. The Metropolitan Manor looked more like a royal wedding venue than a family reunion. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers stretching across the ballroom ceiling like frozen fireworks, waiters in tuxedos gliding around with trays, string quartet humming softly in the corner. Every part of the room whispered, "We are above consequence." And yet, the moment I walked in, the air shifted. Heads turned. Some recognized me instantly. Others squinted, as if seeing a ghost. Pity flickered across a few faces. Suspicion across more. And one thing was obvious. Merrick had done his work. He'd already spun his story. He's not well. He's unstable. Best to keep distance. I could hear their thoughts without hearing a word. I moved past them without responding. I wasn't here to play along. Ilara stood near the stage, glittering in a metallic gown, smiling as though the whole evening revolved around her orbit. She caught sight of me and gave a single raised eyebrow. Not shock, not concern, just calculation. Silas was near the back. He saw me, then looked away. Coward. And Merrick. Merrick stood by the podium, suit crisp, drink untouched. He watched me walk in like a chess player watching a bishop he'd miscounted. The opening speeches began soon after. Merrick stepped to the mic, all smooth charm and father of the family energy. His voice had that polished, public tone, almost like he was narrating a commercial for family values. "We gather tonight not just to celebrate our name," he began, "but to honor the legacy that built it. Our traditions, our loyalty, our commitment to each other." He let the words breathe like a sermon. The crowd nodded. And though not all journeys are straight lines, we must remember that unity requires trust, and that trust, once broken, must be rebuilt carefully. I could feel the implication hang in the air like fog. He was painting me as the reckless one, the unstable returnee, the ghost that refused to stay buried. And for a moment, it worked. I felt the sting in my chest, the heat of 100 gazes that wondered if the rumors were true. But then I remembered. This wasn't about revenge. This was about truth. Halfway through Merrick's speech, something shifted. One of the board members, a woman named Celeste, stood from her seat, holding an envelope. She walked to the front of the room, interrupting the speech. "Before you go on, Merrick," she said calmly, "we received something this afternoon from your brother's legal team." The room turned quiet. Merrick opened the envelope. His face, usually unreadable, turned pale. He blinked once, twice. "Would you care to explain the altered succession contracts?" Celeste asked, louder this time. Gasps swept through the room like a gust of wind. Merrick tried to recover. "This is being manipulated. He's twisting facts. There's nothing legitimate." But the documents were all there. Originals, modified copies, the missing page, the hidden clause. Everything he tried to bury now laid bare in front of the very people he'd tried to impress. I walked up the steps to the stage slowly. No rush, no performance. I didn't grab the mic. I didn't shout. I stood beside him, folder still in hand, and said evenly, "I didn't return to take anything from you." I looked straight at him, then turned to the room. "I came back to stop you from taking what was never yours." Silence, dense and total. Then I opened the folder. From inside, I pulled a photo, scanned from a page I'd found buried in Vault 3, the original succession plan. My name listed first, at age 13. I held it up. "This," I said, "is what was meant to happen." I let them look. The only reason I disappeared from this family's future was because someone made sure I did. A murmur broke loose. Whispers, sharp exhales, hands gripping wine glasses too tight. Ilara stepped forward like she might say something, but the board rep blocked her path. Then came the explosion. "You were never capable," Merrick roared. His voice cracked. His calm shattered. "You were a mistake. Everyone knew it." It was loud, ugly, real. For the first time, the crowd saw what I had seen my entire life. Not the polished patriarch, but the man who built his kingdom on silence and control. Even Silas stepped back from him. Ilara's face twisted, unsure whether to help or flee. Merrick was unraveling, and everyone could see it. I waited for him to stop. Then, without raising my voice, I turned back to the crowd. "For years," I said, "I was treated like I didn't matter. Like I was an embarrassment best forgotten. But I'm not here to ask for forgiveness or a seat at the table." I handed a folder to Celeste. "I'm here to file a formal request for a misconduct investigation." A ripple of reaction surged again, but quieter this time, deeper. I wasn't just demanding justice, I was proving it. The ceremony didn't end with applause. It ended with truth. People began coming up to me, not out of obligation, but out of something closer to respect. They shook my hand, said words like, "I never knew," or "I'm sorry for what you've been through." Silas approached quietly. "I didn't know how far he'd go," he said. "You didn't want to know," I replied, then walked away. Alara slipped out without a word. Merrick stayed where he was, breathing hard, hands clenched, surrounded by no one. His empire, I realized, had never been built on stone. It was built on sand. As I stepped off the stage, Celeste touched my arm. "We'll speak tomorrow," she said. Then softer. "But for now, you did the right thing." I nodded, not because I needed her affirmation, but because something in her voice told me she meant it. I stayed in the ballroom for a few more minutes, watching people scatter like leaves after a gust of wind. Then I turned and walked out into the winter night, quiet and clear, as if New York itself had exhaled. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. The air in my hotel suite felt different, lighter still. For the first time in years, I wasn't waking to dread. There was no weight crushing my chest, no rehearsing what I'd say, no wondering how to navigate a room full of knives and tuxedos. Just quiet. I got dressed slowly. Simple charcoal suit, clean white shirt, nothing flashy. I left the tie hanging. Today wasn't about image. I slid the silver button into my coat pocket, paused, then grabbed the folder holding everything we'd presented the night before. Evidence. Truth. Downstairs, the concierge greeted me by name. No hesitation this time, no blank stare, no sideways glance. Just a warm, "Good morning, Mr. Gray." It caught me off guard more than it should have. The estate board's offices were tucked behind a quiet limestone facade uptown, dignified, discreet. Celeste met me in the lobby and walked me through marble corridors lined with paintings of long-gone patriarchs. She didn't say much until we reached the private boardroom. Inside, every seat was filled. This time, there was no delay, no checking credentials, no waiting outside. They were expecting me. Celeste opened the meeting with a brief recap. Then she turned to me and gestured for the folder. I handed it over without speaking. What followed wasn't dramatic. It was procedural, efficient, clinical. They reviewed the copies of the altered succession agreements, compared timestamps, analyzed metadata from the access logs. Merrick's name was on everything. He hadn't just manipulated paperwork. He had systematically abused his access, rewritten history, and positioned himself as the rightful heir to something he'd stolen. The vote came quickly, unanimous, suspended pending full investigation, business privileges revoked, access frozen. Just like that, the Gray Empire began to shift. I stepped outside into the morning light. It was cold, but the sun was out, low and pale above the skyline. I leaned against the railing, exhaled slowly. I should have felt victorious. But what I felt was more complicated. I didn't destroy Merrick. He'd done that to himself. And knowing that he chose this path, that he could have done differently, but didn't, carried a sorrow that surprised me. For all his cruelty, I had never wanted to see him fall this way. Not really. I was about to head back to the hotel when I saw Silas waiting near the curb. He didn't wave, just stood there, hands deep in his coat pockets, shoulders hunched like the years had finally caught up with him. He looked older than I remembered. When I reached him, he didn't speak right, away. Then softly, "I should have stood up for you a long time ago." I didn't flinch. "You don't owe me anything," I said, "but you owe yourself better than living in his shadow." He nodded, not a defensive one, a heavy one. We stood there like that, no rush to pretend things were okay. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. Around noon, Celeste texted, "Alara left New York this morning. No statement, no contact." I didn't respond. What was there to say? Alara had always preferred exits over accountability, and this time, I didn't feel the need to chase closure. Some doors don't need to be slammed shut. They simply stop opening. Back at the hotel, I sat in the lobby for a while, phone in hand. A few messages from cousins, a couple from people who hadn't spoken to me in years, suddenly remembering my number. I didn't reply. Then the email came. The board had launched formal proceedings. Merrick's assets were under review. His board seat suspended. Internal audits underway. I read it twice. Then I put the phone down and let the stillness settle around me. He built the cliff. I just refused to follow him off it. Later that afternoon, I walked north, past Central Park, until I found the quiet cafe tucked between a tailor's shop and an old bookstore. The sign hadn't changed. Same hand-painted lettering. Same copper bell above the door. This was the place my grandfather used to bring me when I was a kid, before all the fractures. Before I understood what being a gray really meant. I ordered the tea he used to drink, sat in the corner booth near the window, reached into my coat and took out the silver button, set it on the table, let the light catch it. He was the only one who had seen something in me before it was convenient, before it was safe. And even after they erased me from the succession line, I remembered what he said. They can take the paper, Calder, but they can't take the truth. I ran my thumb along the ridges of that button and whispered, I kept my promise. I didn't let them erase me. By the time I returned to the hotel, the sky had dimmed. Lights blinked on across the city like it was exhaling after a long, tight breath. The staff greeted me with something that felt like respect, but I didn't need it. Not anymore. I had come back looking for acknowledgement, maybe even revenge. What I found was something quieter, something harder to earn. Myself. I sat by the window that night, watching Manhattan move, and I thought, I walked into that reunion thinking they owed me something. I walked out realizing the only person I ever needed to prove anything to was me.